Aujourd'hui, nous constatons que les informations manquent. Janesh l'a évoqué tout à l'heure dans son propos, et la nomination d'un conseiller spécial pour la préservation de l'espace humanitaire annoncée lors de la réunion du Conseil de sécurité du mois de juillet devra contribuer à avancer dans cette direction. Mais nous devons aussi collectivement prendre la parole pour dénoncer plus systématiquement toutes les attaques qui sont portées contre les travailleurs humanitaires. Aller au-delà de la promotion du droit international humanitaire, cela veut dire aussi qu'il nous est nécessaire de continuer à nous battre contre l'impunité des infractions commises à l'encontre des travailleurs humanitaires. Lorsque des violations sont commises, nous devons traduire en justice les auteurs. Et à cet égard, la Cour pénale internationale doit jouer un rôle essentiel et la coopération des États avec la Cour pénale internationale et des États entre eux sera déterminante pour lutter contre l'impunité des auteurs de violations graves du droit international humanitaire. Enfin, la lutte contre les violations du droit international humanitaire suppose d'étoffer, lorsque cela est pertinent, les régimes de mesures restrictives. Les violations de ce droit doivent constituer un motif de désignation à part entière et la France continuera à plaider en faveur du renforcement des régimes de sanctions au bénéfice des populations affectées. Mes chers amis, le droit international humanitaire est l'un des fondements de l'ordre international qui repose sur des règles auxquelles nous sommes tous attachés. Je souhaite que la réunion d'aujourd'hui permette d'identifier les bonnes pratiques et qu'elle puisse contribuer à sa mise en œuvre et à sa défense. La France y prendra toute sa part et poursuivra ses efforts à l'occasion d'un moment fort de la prochaine présidence française de l'Union européenne. Au premier semestre 2022, nous organiserons le premier forum humanitaire européen dans la droite ligne de nos volontés communes sur ce sujet majeur. Merci de votre attention.
Thank you, Excellencies, for those very helpful opening remarks, and welcome. I have the pleasure of now being able to introduce our panel. We have 4 panelists today to discuss in somewhat more detail the issue. We are joined by Mr. Peter Maurer, the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Mr. Jan Egeland, the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, Mr. Martin Griffiths, the UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, and Ms. Anissa Bellal, the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian and Human Rights Senior Research Fellow and Strategic Advisor on International Humanitarian Law. Welcome to you all, and thanks very much for joining us today to discuss this important topic. Mr. Maurer, I believe we are turning to you first, please.
Thanks a lot, Susannah. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. This year, I have visited ICRC operations in Afghanistan, the Central African Republic, Mozambique, Syria, and Yemen, amongst others. Unique contexts, but the same equation. When wars are fought in violation of the law without mercy or humanity, the humanitarian impact is enormous. Not confined to loss of life or injury, protracted wars are damaging entire social systems, essential services, and economies. Parties to conflicts continue to violate or flout the most basic rules of international humanitarian law on a scale that is cause for global alarm, and Janis Lenarčič and Jean-Yves Le Drian have well articulated that in their introduction. While serious violations of IHL can hardly be denied in a hyper-connected and data-driven world, national and international level responses often seem so scarce, uncoordinated, and inadequate. The ICRC therefore appreciates the efforts led by France and Germany and the European Union to strengthen accountability and respect for IHL through the humanitarian call for action. The ICRC's experience as a frontline humanitarian actor tells us that accountability and penalties are not the only drivers for ensuring respect for the law. Respect is enhanced when laws become part of strong normative frameworks and are thoroughly implemented on the battlefield. Compliance with IHL can and does occur regularly, and the ICRC sees the positive humanitarian impact that results when law is respected. more than 70 years after the adoption of the Geneva Conventions, enjoy universal ratification, and constant progress is made towards their integration into domestic law and military doctrine, even if much more must be done. Every day, armed forces implement IHL to reduce war's cost to humanity. For many, respect of the rules is a matter of professional identity and core values. Recognizing the complexity of conflicts and realities of the battlefield today, I bring 5 areas of focus where states can enhance respect for IHL. Firstly, the starting point for states is to bring IHL home, as we say in the Red Cross movement. This includes ratifying or acceding to IHL treaties, integrating IHL into domestic law, and incorporating IHL obligations into military training and doctrine. It also means conducting effective domestic investigations into incidents involving potential IHL violations when they occur. To assist states with investigating violations of IHL, the ICRC, the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, has produced the first document at the international level on that subject. Proper investigations undertaken by states at the domestic level are an essential tool for ensuring compliance with IHL and are a form of accountability to a state-owned population, to the victims of violations, as well as to the international community. Secondly, the increasing trend towards alliances in conflict is an untapped potential for states, be they extending or receiving support, to use their influence to protect victims of conflict. As states retreat from direct involvement in extraterritorial conflict and as armed groups fragment, it is becoming increasingly difficult to attribute responsibility for violations and insist on corrective measures. The chain of influence on warring parties links states to non-state actors through political, financial, and material support. In the ICRC's latest analysis on non-state armed groups, we have identified 605 armed groups of humanitarian concern operating in 44 countries, and we estimate that half of these groups are supported by states. The ICRC invites all actors to look further at how their influence in partnering military operations can be leveraged to better protect civilians. To support parties to uphold their responsibility, we have recently launched an initiative called Support Relations in Armed Conflicts, and we look forward to continuing our dialogue with states. Thirdly, the third area for states to ensure compliance with IHL is on counterterrorism and sanctions measures that limit humanitarian action. While sanctions remain a legitimate political tool, any measure must be consistent with IHL obligations to protect impartial humanitarian action. This point is well recognized. The UN Security Council has urged states to take into account the effect of counterterrorism measures on humanitarian activities. The General Assembly has sought to ensure that they do not impede humanitarian activities nor engagements with actors. Our call now is for widespread implementation. An opportunity for states to show leadership is an upcoming renewal of UN sanctions regime, including on Afghanistan. Having just visited Afghanistan, I saw the enormous needs for women, men, boys, and girls. Humanitarian aid must urgently and freely be able to reach them. Fourthly, the ICRC is challenged by a convergence of different forms of violence. High levels of criminal or intercommunal violence intermix with armed conflict. Additionally, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the role played by armed forces and other security actors in public order responses. In such contexts, including those below the threshold of conflict, multiple legal frameworks may be applicable, leading to uncertainty. The ICRC engages with security actors to help clarify limits on the use of force and to train their armed forces to act responsibly. Ensuring the protection of civilians is our primary concern. And fifthly, advancing technologies are giving rise to new weapons and modes of warfare, and in turn create a new humanitarian concerns. IHL provides a battle-tested set of rules that impose essential limits during warfare. new or old, cyber or kinetic. For instance, that hospital must be respected and protected at all times, including against cyber operations. In many fora, states are discussing the limits imposed by IHL on cyber operations in armed conflicts. The ICRC urges states to work towards greater clarity on the limits that existing rules of IHL impose on cyber operations. Affirming IHL applicability should under no circumstances be misunderstood as encouraging the militarization of the cyberspace or as legitimizing cyber warfare. IHL limits warfare and protects civilians. Colleagues, we must guard against the suffering that results from IHL violations and any kind of impunity for them. It is the task of the international community to uphold the law and to take practical steps to prevent the suffering of civilians in conflicts around the world. States and other actors already have many tools available to respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law. Your task is to thoroughly implement them. I thank you.
Thank you very much for your remarks, Mr. Maurer. Turning next, I believe we will hear from Mr. Jan Egeland, the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council. Mr. Egeland.
Thank you very much, Susannah. Warm gratitude to the European Commission, to France and to Germany for being friends and allies in shedding light on the violations of international humanitarian law, in promoting more monitoring, but also in committing to follow up, to have action when we see what is happening. It does, of course, start with monitoring. So I welcome very much Commissioner Lenarchik's announcement that the European Commission will invest in this. Too many places, people suffer alone without the world knowing what hit them and who was responsible for the violations of the international humanitarian law. But I'd like to speak now today also on the importance of following up when we have monitored, when we have seen the violations, when we see that groups, civilians, vulnerable communities are under threat. There must be action. There must be consequences. There must be predictability. And I do believe that the United Nations as an institutions and UN member states can help us more in this. The human rights colleagues and the diplomats who are speaking out and up on these issues is something very welcomed by us as humanitarians. We can also speak out. All of us can do more. We're on the ground, we're witnesses to horrific abuse by responsible armed actors against vulnerable civilians. But we're also vulnerable because we're in the field. Humanitarians are there with thousands of colleagues in the crossfire, exposed to the parties, exposed to exertive governments. That is also a limitation. So indeed, we need diplomats, member states, human rights colleagues to be upfront to expose what is happening. However, we also need this follow-up. And we also need follow-up when humanitarian groups are attacked for speaking up. My organization, NRC, has been either suspended or expelled 5 times because we exposed violations of humanitarian law, because we were principled, we think, because we were speaking on behalf of the victims. 5 times. It's too costly now to speak out on behalf of the most vulnerable. So I also have 3 points where I would then focus on what do we do when we have monitored, we know that there are violations or that groups are under threat. And my first point is humanitarian diplomacy. There must be more effective, proactive, consistent humanitarian diplomacy by more champions in the United Nations family of members and institutions. The EU, France, Germany are predictably our friends in this. But even you can do more. And let me give some examples where I find humanitarian diplomacy is really wanting. Speak not only when it is countries, states, governments that you are critical of that are violating humanitarian law. Also be equally assertive, strong with your allies, those you sell arms to, those where you do have leverage. Too often we see that member states are very strong when it's someone distant that they have little leverage on, and they are quiet when they do have possibilities to exert influence. And then we need to have more non-Western countries to push on our behalf and with us humanitarian principles, with parties that violate the law, with assertive governments that limit our humanitarian access. So can we please make allies across the political and cultural and regional spectrum? Can we engage with capitals that do have influence and that too few speak to? I wish there was more engagement in Moscow, in Tehran, in Ankara, in many capitals that are very influential in the areas and the regions where we are active. Humanitarian diplomacy can work. It worked to open some of the besieged areas in Syria after months of starvation. It did lead to the port of Hodeidah in Yemen being not bombed as it was threatened to be, and the blockade was also at least partially lifted. Humanitarian diplomacy can work if it is effectively implied. And then 2 more points. Always act in a principled manner as member states of the UN. And do that also when you apply sanctions and you apply counterterrorism laws on parties to conflicts. Peter Maurer also mentioned this. I think all of us as humanitarians have seen that it's become too dangerous, too complicated, too cumbersome. We're too often blocked by a whole web of laws and sanctions and so on in some of the areas where women, children, the most vulnerable are in great need. I fear now that it will take too long time for us even to transfer money to the Afghan civilian population. We did not go out the door. We are in Afghanistan. We need to scale up before the winter that happens. But today I was informed that even the Hawala system did not work because of the banking sector and financial transfers not working. This will be killing people. Equally in Northeast Nigeria, Commissioner Lenarchik mentioned Sahel as a phenomenal crisis area. What is holding us back in northeastern Nigeria is certainly attacks by listed armed actors that are designated as terrorists, but also local and international laws that make it impossible for us to reach 1 million people that are in areas where these listed groups roam or even control territory. My final point is that I believe one important tool that we need to employ much more systematically to protect civilians is deconfliction. Deconfliction is there in humanitarian traditions for generations. We tell parties to conflicts where the protected sites are, where the hospitals are, where the convoys go, where the humanitarian compounds are, where the displacement camps are. The parties commit to protect these according to humanitarian law. There are no military targets there. There are no armed men in these sites. The United Nations is playing an important role in many countries to organize deconfliction systems. I think they could be more predictably doing such. I did lead a panel set down by Secretary General Guterres to look at, evaluate, and come with recommendations for the deconfliction system in Syria, where so many hospitals have been bombed. The report is with the Secretary General. It is with OCHA. I hope our recommendations on monitoring, investigations, accountability can be followed up. So I end there with my plea. All those who will discuss this and who are our friends in protecting international humanitarian law, do strengthen monitoring, do strengthen investigation, but do also strengthen follow-up action. The gang-raped women in armed conflict, they do not need another blanket or a more balanced food basket. They need that the perpetrators are put to justice and that their daughters are not again seeing the rape that they were subject to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Egeland, for those remarks. Very helpful. I believe we are turning now to UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Martin Griffiths. Mr.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Susannah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting, and chapeau, of course, to the European Commission, France, Monsieur Le Drian, and Germany, later Heiko Maas. It's very difficult to have to speak after Jan Egeland, because and for him it was very difficult because he had to speak after Peter Maurer, and I am trailing both of them. And I want to start by saying that I was listening very careful to every word that both Jan and Peter were saying, and I associate myself with all of it. And it's an unusual moment for me in which I see things that I need to do more of because of these public debates, and I'm very grateful to Jan and Peter for that. But and of course, Jan, with his particular experience of being in this position that I'm in, as well as now on the front lines, where Peter has always been, brings such a lot of not just wisdom, but experience and presence to make these issues vivid to us. And I'm very grateful, even if I, regret having to follow them and be probably a bit lame. But anyway, there you go. But anyway, thanks again to the Commission and to France and Germany. Over the last 150 years, we have all invested considerable effort and political will to strengthen the international legal framework that preserves human dignity in war, and where we see Peter as its president and its witness and its guardian here with us today. And yet, as he was saying, armed conflict is marked by high levels of civilian death and injury, perhaps as high as ever, as well as effects on health, food, and water systems. And the human cost, as we are seeing in many of our protracted crises, endures long after a conflict has ended. And I make reference to Jan's last example of the protection worries, which the trauma, which go beyond the event and live in the lives of those who have suffered these unspeakable crimes. I've traveled since taking up this job quite recently to Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and Syria. And sort of as is always the case in those places, I was able to meet, never enough, but always it's the most interesting part of the visit, is to meet women, men, youth, community members, professionals, non-professionals, doctors, and so forth, and particularly those who frankly suffered from the events of the year and the previous years, but also talking to parties to the conflict as well as to our own humanitarian colleagues. They, in their different ways, spoke to me of the central message that we are here to debate today, which is the basis upon which assistance should be given and the basis upon which they will escape the trauma and suffering of today and yesterday is respect for international humanitarian law. And we continue to say, and we will continue always to say, how important it is to ensure that all those people are protected and that we should base our assistance on those principles. France and Germany 2 years ago launched the call for action, which I welcome very much today, to strengthen the implementation of humanitarian law and the protection of humanitarian and healthcare workers in conflicts. We are hearing today already about progress. Commissioner Lenarčič vividly and I think fluently described to us the importance of data and documenting and analyzing harm to civilians as a basis then for doing something about it. And like others, I welcome his commitments to invest further in that part of this problem. And monitoring analysis are extremely important. Others before me have said exactly that. Thanks to those efforts which document, which remind, and which forbid us to ignore these infringements of IHL, we can not escape the obligations that go with action that comes out of these reports. There is increasingly less and less excuse for ignorance or avoidance. So the tracking, investigating, and reporting must continue. It's the vital first step. As the relentless human cost of armed conflicts persists, like others, I'd like to focus on the next step. What do you do with it? What do we do with this evidence base? What we need to do to ensure compliance and bring, if this is not some distant dream, an end to impunity. The core issue is, of course, as has been said already, parties to the conflict often disregard international humanitarian law, which is an inconvenience and is easily disregarded, and for which there are regrettably few consequences. We continue to insist that they must respect their obligations under IHL. We know that the results when they don't are deadly. Just as an illustration, last year, when explosive weapons were used in populated areas, 88% of those killed or injured were civilians. So the deadly cost of abuse of IHL is not simply another fact, it's another life. So something is needed, political will, of course, to increase the efforts to stop impunity. It depends, again, Jan spoke about humanitarian diplomacy, a combination of dialogue, capacity building, political pressure, accountability, and frankly, the actions of activists and the actions in the field of humanitarian workers who are both witnesses and activists, who observe these abuses and act upon them. Member states, on the basis of this evidence, receive a basis upon which to take action. And many have enhanced their compliance with international humanitarian law through training armed forces and groups so they're better prepared to protect civilians, and to resourcing organizations like Geneva Call, for example, which directly connects to armed groups and presses for their observance of IHL. Member states with influence have used their leverage to push for humanitarian access in multiple contexts, CAR, Myanmar, Yemen, and some have frozen their arms sales to warring parties out of concern for their non-compliance with IHL. I check the box here with Jan's point about also push those who are your allies, as well as those with whom you have differences. I think that's a very important point. Some states have increasingly exercised broad or indeed universal jurisdiction to pursue accountability for war crimes. This must be welcomed. This is innovative law, and it's shown by the rise in the number of such cases in recent years. According to the NGO Trial International, today 150 suspects have been arrested, detained, or are on trial in 18 countries on such matters, on such charges. These are good. I hesitate to say word beginnings because, as Peter would say, this has been an issue for 160 years. But these are good efforts. More can be done, and that's what we're here to urge today. And the practices of improving capacity, of chasing impunity, of innovative law, of humanitarian diplomacy with all and sundry, these should become the norms, perhaps, rather than the trailblazers. I think as I said at the beginning, Susannah, take away already from this discussion things that I need to do and my colleagues need to do differently and more. Of course, I commit, it hardly needs saying, to advocate for the respect of IHL and the protection of civilians, because this is also at the heart of my office's mandate. And finally, I'd like to draw attention to the threats to humanitarian operations. In 2020, at least 169 security incidents, that's the right word, against humanitarian workers were recorded in 19 states affected by conflict. National staff accounted for a shocking more than 92% of those affected. Incidents is a very interesting word to use here. Incidents included shootings, IEDs, bodily harm, sexual assault, kidnapping, and they resulted in the deaths of 99 humanitarian workers. As I say, the huge majority are the national staff of our organizations who served with great courage. Other pressing challenges, and Peter has spoken extensively about this, include the multiplication and fragmentation of armed groups. I'm fascinated by Peter's statistic about the numbers of armed groups which have support in some form of state. Extremist ideologies, these have not gone away. That famous war on terror doesn't seem to have achieved any of those objectives. So extremist ideologies opposed to humanitarian values in particular, the politicization of humanitarian access, the transactionalism, which I, for example, witnessed frequently and firsthand in Yemen these past years. And as Peter has mentioned, the sometimes adverse impact of counterterrorism laws and sanctions measures, and the chilling impact of those measures, even when exemptions are granted, should be taken into account. Now, to strengthen our work in tackling these threats, and here, Susannah, I'm coming to a conclusion, the Secretary General of the United Nations has asked me to appoint a special advisor on the preservation of humanitarian space, thanks to the initiative of France, of course, in the Security Council, and which will enable us to be better at a focus on these issues and to strengthen humanitarian engagements with all parties to the conflict, including with non-state armed groups, a central feature of OCHA's work, which I hope to make central to my short, brief stint in this position. I look forward to confirming that appointment soon. We will be talking to the Interagency Standing Committee in the next days, and I hope it will indeed help us to take on these challenges and give it more focus. So, Jean-Yves, I'm very grateful to you for the initiative of your government to push that forward in the Council. I think that is most welcome. And finally, very grateful to my previous speakers, but also to the Commission, to France and Germany for the opportunity to learn and to do better. Thank you very much, Susannah.
Thanks very much, Mr. Griffiths. And now rounding out our panel of keynote speakers, we are turning to Anissa Bilal from the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. She is a senior research fellow and strategic advisor. Ms. Bilal.
Thank you very much, Susannah. Ministers, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like first to thank France, Germany, and the EU for inviting me to this important event. I feel honored, and I know I'm privileged to be able to convey to you, members of the UN General Assembly, what we, experts and scholars, believe could enhance monitoring and improve compliance with IHL. We all know what is at stake. What is at stake are sick and wounded persons being bombarded in their hospital beds. What is at stake are entire cities and livelihood destroyed in urban warfare and children dying of hunger because of impediments to humanitarian access. But I believe we would be wrong to consider that in armed conflicts, there are only victims. In fact, there are also women, men, children, be they members of the civil society, state armed forces, or who belong to armed groups that act every day for a better implementation of IHL. For instance, in the ICRC project called IHL in Action, we learned that soldiers aborted an airstrike that they had been authorized to carry out because of their own assessment that the civilian casualties would be too high. We also learned that some armed groups have committed to ban the total use of anti-personnel mines, or that parties to armed conflict often sign agreements to release detainees. People act when they claim to respect of their rights in human rights courts and mechanisms. The Geneva Academy's research has shown how this could be positively used for IHL implementation. And after all, we are gathered here today within the framework of a call for humanitarian action, in which states that have supported this call have pledged, and I quote, to take concrete and substantial steps in order to implement their obligations under Common Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions. With this in mind, I would like to propose two means that could help us act in favor of a better respect for IHL. First, to act, we need clear, detailed, and solid data. We have all witnessed how data was important for policymakers in the context of the COVID pandemic. What age range was most at risk, how the virus was transmitted, if the measures taken were efficient or not, were at the source of the course of action decided by governments. Obviously, in an armed conflict, collecting data is much more challenging. Security issues, lack of access to certain zones, or the fear of victims to testify explain in part these difficulties. But despite these challenges, great data sets have been created, such as the WHO surveillance system for attacks on healthcare, the Aid Worker Security Database, or the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center established by NRC. Recently, an initiative on collecting data on attacks on education in armed conflict has been launched by Education Above All Foundation. These are essential and useful tools that help guide and shape policies. That said, we need more. While it is clear that both states and armed groups are concerned, it still remains rather difficult to know with more precision which acts are committed by which actors. When it comes to monitoring, I believe we would need to be much more specific in identifying the acts committed by armed groups and those committed by states. Approaching parties to an armed conflict with approximation and factual generalization is indeed a too easy way out for them to claim they are not responsible. Like in the COVID pandemic, the more information we have, the better we can assess the situation and adopt efficient responses. And this brings me to my second point. Among the measures proposed by some states to improve compliance of IHL is the system of state voluntary reporting on IHL implementation at the domestic level. The benefits of such reporting lie notably in the process, collecting information, identifying gaps and problems, and generating discussion between different stakeholders at the national level. This is a great idea, but something is missing. because it addresses only one part of the problem. As was mentioned before by Peter Maurer, the majority of contemporary armed conflicts involve today armed groups. Obviously, there is no mechanism of self-reporting foreseen for them, and usually armed groups are left out of the system when it comes to discussing IHL issues, including on implementation. For several years now, the UN Secretary General, in the reports on the protection of civilians, has repeatedly called for sustained engagement with armed groups in order to enhance compliance. In the call for humanitarian action, France and Germany proposed to, I quote, support the provision of training to non-state armed groups on how to respect international humanitarian law and facilitate principled humanitarian action. This is essential, as it is not uncommon that armed groups only have a very general knowledge of the obligations they are bound by. I believe that another necessary measure to support a better implementation of IHL is to include armed groups in the debates and understand their interpretation of core humanitarian norms. Who do they consider to be a civilian? How do they understand the notion of impartiality in humanitarian access? What precautions, what concrete measures do they take prior to a military operation taking place in a populated area? At the Geneva Academy, I'm leading a project in collaboration with Geneva Call and NRC on precisely collecting the views of a selected number of armed groups on core IHL issues, including on conduct of hostilities, the prohibition of forced displacement, and the protection of the medical mission. The project is entitled From Words to Deeds, because we are convinced that it is essential to listen to what armed groups have to say about IHL, increase their ownership of the norms so as to be able to translate their words into acts that comply with the law. Ministers, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we have in our hands tools that provide us with data and facts, research that tries to understand the causes of the violations committed by all parties to an armed conflict. Of course, more research and more data should be collected. But if we want to enhance monitoring and compliance with IHL, at some point, we just need to do it. Because as the saying goes, action does speak louder than words. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Belal, and thank you to all of our keynote speakers for offering those fulsome remarks on this important topic. This means that we are now turning to remarks and interventions from the floor. Many thanks to everyone who expressed an interest in participating. We did receive an overwhelming level of interest, which is very heartening given this, given the importance of this topic. So we have had to limit the number of interventions, and I thank you for your understanding about that. In any event, we are welcoming written comments that we will compile and share after the event. So if we're unable to take your remarks during the event itself, please do share your remarks and interventions in writing. I would also remind and ask each speaker to please do limit yourself to 2 minutes as we take interventions going forward. We are first turning to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sweden, Ms. Ann Lind.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Germany and France, for organizing this important event. In armed conflicts today, we are witnessing an eroding respect for basic rules on international humanitarian law. The international community cannot remain silent, and we need to honor the obligation not only to respect, but also ensure respect for international humanitarian law. We joined the Call for Action initiative in 2019 to demonstrate our full support for the efforts to ensure accountability for the most serious international crimes through new as well as exciting multilateral mechanisms. Sweden takes action to ensure accountability for IHL violation at both international and national level. Sweden chairs the biannual resolution status of the protocols additional to the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and relating to the protection of victims of armed conflicts, whereby the UN General Assembly reaffirms its commitment to respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law in all circumstances. We support investigative mechanisms at the international level, such as the international, impartial, and independent mechanism for the most serious crimes under international law committed in Syrian Arab Republic as well as in Chad. We support the work of the Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission established under Article 90 of the first additional protocol to the Geneva Convention of 1949, and I'm honored to say that we have decided to nominate our current member, Dr. Åsa Molde, for a second 5-year term in the elections in Bern in November. Furthermore, Sweden has contributed to the development of the ICRC guidance document and the protection of healthcare in armed conflict, which was launched in March this year, and which aims to find concrete ways forward to protect healthcare while carrying out military operation. Finally, under our universal jurisdiction for crimes against humanity and war crime, Sweden was the first country with convictions for serious crimes in Syria. Preliminary investigation against Daesh supporters are underway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Turning now to Secretary Mohsin, Secretary of the Ministry for Disaster Management and Relief in Bangladesh. Secretary.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I will speak 2 minutes in Bangladesh context. It is evident from the past historical records and instances the Rohingya ethnic group of Myanmar is one of the most persecuted ethnic groups of the world. Initially, more than 200,000 Rohingyas fled into Bangladesh in 1977. Later, in 1991, nearly 250,000. In August 2017, approximately 1 million Rohingya minorities fled into the phase of ethnic cleansing and entered Bangladesh. Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina had taken a kind, humanitarian, timely, and courageous step to let these persecuted, forcibly displaced Myanmar nationals provided with food, shelters, and other facilities and the protection. The infamous activities perpetrated by Myanmar side, all the clear violation of international laws, treaties, protocols, conventions, including Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, 1979. Though Myanmar ratified the Convention on 22nd July 1997 and Universal Declaration of Human Rights 1948 and Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide 1951. If the persistent violations of international humanitarian law and taken into account and action taken on that, then the overall situation could be improved. Thus, quick action as well as intervention is required, as there is no sign from the Myanmar side till today to uphold the international laws, treaties, protocols, and conventions that will ensure safe and dignified life through repatriation for the forcibly displaced Myanmar nationals. Bangladesh supports the ongoing international efforts to ensure accountability, including in the ICJ. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. The Minister of State for Foreign Affairs for Portugal, Mr. Augusto Santos Silva.
Thank you very much. Allow me to salute the European Union, France and Germany for co-organizing this event. Portugal is strongly committed to the international humanitarian law and is gravely concerned about the many and various serious reports of its violation in current armed conflicts. The international humanitarian law protects human life and dignity in armed conflict. It is not due to the lack of a solid and comprehensive legal framework that we witness breaches of fundamental rules of the law of armed conflict. In fact, the greatest challenge is rather the implementation of that legal framework. This situation calls for a multilateral reflection and ownership on how to better implement and uphold the principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. And in that regard, the call for action to strengthen respect for international humanitarian law and principle humanitarian action launched 2 years ago by Germany and France, which Portugal has endorsed, is one big example of the multilateral approach we need. Portugal has adopted several measures for disseminating the international humanitarian law, this being also an obligation under the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, both in peacetime and in in armed conflict. Alleged violations of the international humanitarian law and of human rights must be recorded to safeguard the rule of law, effective accountability, and post-conflict rehabilitation and reconciliation, including through transitional justice. Thus, Portugal has been a supporter of the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission established under the Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions. Portugal also sees the international criminal justice as a valuable element in ensuring accountability for the most serious crimes of concern to the international community, ending impunity for perpetrators of these crimes. In closing, I want to reiterate the many current challenges to protect human beings caught up in hostilities demand creative and coordinated responses from every addressee of international humanitarian law obligations. Portugal is committed to continue to play an active role in those coordinated responses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Next, we go to Minister Bogdan Orescu, the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Romania.
Well, thank you so much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to join this very important event dedicated to a cause of great relevance for Romania and for my mandate as Foreign Minister, which is improving compliance with international humanitarian law. While it is true that the nature and types of conflict are changing under the pressure of new technology and socio-political developments, the relevance of the principles and norms enshrined in the 4 Geneva Conventions has stood the test of time. At the same time, we should remain attuned to the changing operational landscape and respond to the new phenomena by means of clarifying the norms applied to armed conflicts. Moreover, we should not look at these legal interpretations in abstract, but in terms of the needs of protection and engagement as they arise on the ground. As we continue to witness grave violations of IHL worldwide, we must acknowledge that the underlying problem is not a lack of rules, but a lack of proper enforcement and oversight. The Geneva Conventions are an exception among international treaties because they do not provide states with an opportunity to meet on a regular basis to discuss ways of enhancing their implementation. Romania was among the countries that have argued in favor of a space of regular and non-politicized space dialogue among states at the global level with the view to strengthening respect for IHL. As the intergovernmental consultations to this end failed, we must seek other ways of reaching this goal. We should not shy away from examining IHL breaches based on independent data with due regard to avoid political instrumentalization of the international humanitarian law. From this point of view, the example of the International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent attests the possibility of maintaining this discussion on a neutral ground. We look to the ICRC as a traditional partner and guardian of IHL for relevant ideas, while we are ready to engage in a new joint endeavor in support of IHL compliance, together with other interested actors. In line with the latest international conference resolution bringing IHL home, we must remind ourselves that galvanizing action at the international level should be matched by a continual effort to ensure respect for IHL domestically. In this context, Romania is proud to join the growing community of states that have elaborated a national voluntary report on the implementation of IHL at domestic level. Our report, elaborated within the framework of the National Commission on IHL and then adopted this June by the government and published online, is part of a broader set of measures undertaken by the Romanian authorities to boost knowledge and implementation of IHL, and will be followed most notably by an update of the national strategy for the implementation of IHL. To conclude, ensuring compliance with IHL is both a legal and a moral imperative. We remain available to further contribute to this debate, while we congratulate France and Germany for their determination to keep this topic high on the international agenda under the umbrella of helpful initiatives such as the Humanitarian Call for Action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Turning next to Minister Ismail Old Sheikh Ahmed, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Cooperation and Mauritanians Abroad of the Islamic Republic of Mauritania, please.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Thank you very much, Susannah. I would like to congratulate France, Germany, and you for this very important initiative, and particularly for this call for action. Of course, I'm speaking here as a minister and therefore as a representative of my government, but I can't avoid saying that this also brings a lot of memories of my time as humanitarian coordinator. And therefore, I will first start by my government action in regard to this issue. I think the EU Commissioner said it very eloquently. We believe in Mauritania that IHL is not an option, it is an obligation. And that's why we have, as you know today, because of the conflict, unfortunately, in Mali, over 70,000 refugees, and we have never closed our borders, neither for international humanitarian access or for the refugees themselves. And we have been welcoming all the refugees all over. In addition, as somebody said, and I think it's Martin, the importance of the armed force training and the security forces is part of our, and particularly a very serious training on IHL, which is actually supported by the EU and the High Commission on Human Rights. That's part also of my government memory. I can't go too long, therefore I will go for a bit of the memories of my time as humanitarian coordinator and say that, of course, I feel here a lot of pain, because when I realize how many times we have been deprived from access, either when I was in Syria or was in Libya, and of course, more recently in Libya. Obviously, as certainly Martins know very well, there is this insidious, vicious link between the political process and the humanitarian access that actors, particularly non-state actors, try to make. That every time you want to have a concession on the political side, you have to give it at the cost of obtaining sometimes some access to food or prisoners, freedom or health, which is obviously something we do with a lot of decision, because as you say, it's an obligation and something really very, very painful. But I have to say, and it's opportune for me to congratulate my friend Martin Griffith for being appointed today as the head of OCHA. I think nobody can make that link and try to think about this, what I call the insidious link, which we should try to know how we deal with that. I know there is no specific response. Of course, the main challenge we have been facing are always these non-state actors. Obviously, I know there are violations, and there are a lot of violations from government, but not state actors. I think Dr. Anissa said it very well. Sometimes they are also part of our allies in the ground. They sometimes even help us to implement most of the time. And I speak about civil society actors locally, national, who takes it at their own risk to make sure that we can have a road to access, or that we can bring food or medicine to some of these areas. So again, as I said, I'm not going to be too long. I will emphasize the importance, of course, of the political will, the capacity building, the constant reminder, what we are doing today is the right thing. So we should not let this issue be forgotten. It's an obligation, and it has to be constantly on the agenda, the international agenda. I would like to emphasize that there is no exception. No state is above the law, and this should be constant in our position also, that we make sure that there is a sort of consistency on our messages all states when it comes to violation. And obviously, as I said, the constant challenge to deal with the non-state actors. For the sake of time, unfortunately, Susannah, I will have to stop here, but thank you for inviting me, something to which I'm very committed, and I would like to congratulate and thank again the organizers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister. Turning now to the Minister for Foreign and European Affairs of Malta, Mr. Evariste Bartolo. Minister.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this event. Okay. Thank you for organizing this event. Malta was proud to support the call for action way back in September 2019 to bolster international humanitarian law, and was one of the first countries to adhere to this action. Although we have mechanisms in place within the European Union to monitor potential violations of international humanitarian law, much work needs to be done so that we strengthen independent data collection and analysis on potential abuses across the world. The lack of an independent, comprehensive data source on international humanitarian law violations weakens efforts by the EU and other actors to respond to violations and to ensure accountability. We fully support the work done by actors such as the International Criminal Court, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria. However, we are faced with great humanitarian abuses in many other countries where action is hindered by a lack of reliable data. Our credibility suffers if we are selective when we denounce IHS, and we will be accused of hypocrisy and double standards if we look the other way if such violations are committed where we, our allies and friends are involved. Malta will bring information on such issues to the attention of international community. Indeed, this is one of the main issues we intend to focus on as part of our candidature for a seat on the UN Security Council during 2023-2024. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Okay, next we turn to Minister Peter Szijjártó, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Hungary.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the possibility to address this very important issue here. We do share the view that the promotion of the compliance with the IHL is a highly relevant question nowadays. We also do agree that ending impunity of those committing the most serious crimes of concern to the international community is not possible without effective monitoring of the IHL violations. Hungary has always been a great supporter of improving international humanitarian law, which is demonstrated by the fact that we ratified all relevant international instruments on the IHL, and we do ensure the respect for the implementation in all circumstances, obviously. We have recognized the competence of the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission, and we have supported its mandate since its inception. At the last international conference of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, we pledged to ensure a broader awareness regarding the existence and competencies of the IHFFC, leading to its broader recognition and an increased use of its services. In our view, increased use of services of the Commission could lead to a better respect for the IHL. I think it's absolutely necessary to address the issue of mass migration here, which remains a global challenge in the upcoming years to come. And we do believe that one of the major root causes of the massive illegal migratory flows is clearly the suffering caused by the violations of IHL. That's why we firmly reject that migration is purely a positive phenomenon. And we think that instead of creating further pull factors, we should focus on the real solutions, and we should tackle the root causes, tackle them locally. So instead of promoting and inspiring migration, we have to stop it by providing assistance to the third countries locally. We have to make sure that it is being ensured that people can stay in their homeland in peace and prosperity. We do believe that this is the most fundamental human right. So preventing and ending violations of IHL also serves preventing migration, also helps enabling people to stay in their homes, and this is a high priority for us. I really appreciate the organizers, Germany and France, Heiko and Jean-Yves, to put together this initiative. I think it's very timely and very useful. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you. I believe we have a couple of interventions that are coming to us by pre-recorded video. We turn next to Minister Jose Manuel Alvarez, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation for Spain.
Dear ministers, dear friends, thank you for giving me the opportunity to intervene on this meeting on how we reinforce compliance with international humanitarian law. Humanitarian diplomacy must be at the core of our international actions if we want to ensure humanitarian assistance. Today, the crisis in Afghanistan has shown us how necessary it is to preserve the humanitarian space for all good reasons. Spain is taking concrete steps to fulfill the 23 promises at the 30th conference in Geneva. We must look at the next Geneva conference in 2023 as a milestone and reinforce commitments and actions that bring us closer to the elimination of all violations of international humanitarian law. Spain is finalizing its first strategy for humanitarian diplomacy, a pioneering exercise to move this agenda forward across segments of our government and abroad. We must also persevere in the fight against impunity. The international community and states must count with effective mechanisms to bring the perpetrators to justice, including the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. This is the best way to honor the victims, bring them justice, and deter future violation. To this end, we are working together with the International Peace Institute in improving data sharing and investigation on attacks against medical missions in line with the Geneva Convention and UN Security Council Resolution 2286. Unfortunately, we are witnessing how education is under attack in conflicts and humanitarian settings. This is why Spain is firmly committed towards the universalization of the Safe Schools Declaration. In 2019, Spain hosted in Palma the third International Conference on Safe Schools. It was a success, and it showed the intimate connection between development, peace, and security. Next month, we will be co-hosting with Nigeria the fourth International Conference in Abuja. Finally, let me conclude by saying that we are on this together. We must prevent and condemn international humanitarian law violation and remember the duty to protect civilians in conflict through more robust international overview. Political-driven awareness, more resources, and better control are actions that enable us to create the condition of possibility to prevent this violation. We have to be bold and concrete, ambitious but realistic, generous but effective, creative and proactive. We must contribute to this work day by day, action by action. We know this, and rest assured that Spain will continue to be actively committed to expanding the respect of international humanitarian law. We have come a long way, but there is still a lot to be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next intervention from Croatia, Mr. Goran Grlić-Radman, the Minister of Foreign and European Affairs.
Distinguished ministers, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to extend my appreciation to Germany and France for organizing this important gathering. Croatia is honored to be among like-minded countries which joined the humanitarian call for action. In the ongoing conflicts around the world, we witness deliberate violation of international humanitarian law, such as targeting of civilians and civilian institutions, including humanitarian and medical personnel. As a country that had first-hand experience with war, Croatia is particularly committed to strengthening the respect for IHL. At the national level, we have established the National Committee for IHL. We are actively engaged in implementing the provisions of the ICRC resolution, bringing IHL home, a roadmap towards better national implementation of IHL. Within the framework of the Human Rights Council, we have promoted, in close cooperation with our cross-regional partners, the importance of casualty recording. Our joint statement on casualty recording presented during the 45th session of the Council was co-sponsored by 51 states. Casualty recording is an integral part of efforts to monitor respect for international human rights and humanitarian law. The evidence it generates can facilitate the efforts to better protect civilians and prevent violations of IHL. A verified and reliable system of casualty records is also crucial for future accountability process and can help determine if crimes against humanity or war crimes have taken place. Ladies and gentlemen, casualty recording is not just about a number of casualties, rather about each person's identity and fate. As a country that is still searching for 1,858 citizens missing from the homeland war, we are particularly sensitive to this topic. In cooperation with our partners, civil society and ICRC, Croatia organizes webinars and shares its experience helping the state that deal with similar issues. Furthermore, we are working on including the provisions on casualty recording into country-specific resolutions, for example, on Syria and Yemen, emphasizing the importance of compiling a comprehensive, verifiable and transparent record of all casualties of the conflict. Croatia will continue to support bilateral and multilateral efforts in order to enhance monitoring of and compliance with IHL. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next intervention will come from Mr. Alain Delatros, the Director of Geneva Call, Director General of Geneva Call.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as several speakers before me already have mentioned, armed non-state actors are key players in the humanitarian sphere. Over 60 million people are living in territories controlled by armed groups, and close to 160 million lives are affected by armed group activities. It is unfortunately a growing phenomenon that shows no sign of abating. Geneva Call's mission, as Mr. Griffiths gently recalled his audience, is to get in touch with armed groups and bring them to respect basic humanitarian principles. It directly engages with armed groups to increase their level of compliance with and respect for humanitarian norms in armed conflict. Since its creation in 2000, Geneva Call has engaged more than 150 groups from all around the world, obtaining and monitoring public humanitarian commitments on very specific aspects relevant to the specific context addressed. Having precise data on IHL violations is obviously of extreme importance for the international community. Yet, strengthening monitoring mechanisms should be reflected in light with the objectives the collected information will have. For humanitarian actors like Geneva Call, it can help define strategies of engagement on the very specific breaches that happen in very concrete context. As part of its strategy of humanitarian engagement, Geneva Call does monitor the respect of the deeds of commitment that armed groups sign under our auspices. this monitoring does not exclusively focus on violations, but also on situations of compliance and improvement. And it does not cover specific cases, but trends, positive and negative. Our experience shows that discussing trends, and not only isolated cases, even though we do that too, but discussing trends with armed groups may lead to an increased protection of civilians on the ground. In the end, we aim at addressing structural problems that can affect humanitarian norms compliance. And as our contribution to the initiative that France, Germany, and the EU launched at this event, I'm happy to announce that Geneva Call will, from next year onward, regularly publish reports on these trends as a way to help cast a light on conflict settings and thus help ameliorate the situation of individuals living therein. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to France, Germany, and the EU for this necessary and very much expected initiative.
Thank you, Mr. Delatros. Turning next to Ms. Ugochi Daniels, the Deputy Director General for Operations from the International Organization for Migration. Ms. Daniels, go ahead.
Ladies and gentlemen, the UN Migration Agency strongly welcomes this initiative and calls on all states and stakeholders to do their utmost to protect, promote, and uphold international humanitarian law. As an operational, visible, and dedicated humanitarian actor, IOM underscores the critical importance in safeguarding humanitarian space. The egregious violations of humanitarian law that drive displacement, target frontline workers, and limit our delivery of life-saving services must not go unrecorded and unheeded. International humanitarian law, as well as the various existing mechanisms, are fundamental tools in the settings where we work. Improving prevention and ensuring accountability requires our collective commitment and engagement. On behalf of the UN Migration Agency, thank you very much to Germany, France, and the EU for this initiative, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much. And for the last of our interventions from the floor, we turn now to the President and Chief Executive Officer of Save the Children, Ms. Yanti Suripto. Sorry.
Thanks, Susannah. Thank you to the organizers for bringing attention to this issue. I'd like to talk quickly about two aspects relating to children in conflict. Firstly, the Children and Armed Conflict mandate of the Security Council already is a powerful tool to monitor and report on violations. However, this mandate is only as strong as the political will underpinning it. To ensure this remains effective or becomes more effective, we need to preserve dedicated child protection capacity in UN peacekeeping missions, and the UN must deploy staff promptly. And the integrity of the mandate must be preserved. For instance, an accurate and credible list of perpetrators in the Secretary General's annual report, grounded, dare I say it, in impartial evidence, not political considerations. Call me naive, but Save the Children would not stop to ask for this. Secondly, beyond the mandate of the Security Council, we need to address the real accountability gap affecting children in conflict. Despite a disproportionate exposure to violations, children are largely absent from international accountability mechanisms. Save the Children, in partnership with Oxford University, published a report earlier this year calling this out and presenting concrete recommendations, like increasing political and financial support for accountability mechanisms, including children, improving our understanding how to do that, and developing specialized tools to deliver accountability for crimes affecting children. A change of mindset is really needed here. Children are not passive objects lacking in agency. Children are not only entitled to justice, but very capable and able to play their part in securing it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And that closes out the remarks that we will take from the floor. I'd like to thank all of the participants for their contributions to this lively discussion. Maybe just briefly in summary, I think we've heard a lot about the fact that not only are monitoring and reporting critical pieces of enhancing adherence to international humanitarian law, but also important are the actions that the international community takes to follow up when violations do occur, and that it builds the political will and ensures the political will to take on this issue in service of those who are most vulnerable during times of crisis. So thank you all very much for your thoughtful remarks. And to close out our discussion today, I'd like to turn to Ambassador Sibylle Katharina Sorg, the German Director General for Humanitarian Affairs, Stabilization, Crisis Prevention, and Peace Building.
Thank you, Susannah. And let me start by thanking all our speakers today for their most valuable contributions. And of course, our co-hosts, France and the European Commission, for the very good cooperation and the strong shared commitment to defending the humanitarian space. Minister Maas, who is prevented from joining, sends his regards and has asked me to speak on his behalf. I think we had a remarkably encouraging and meaningful exchange today. Encouraging because we all fully agree that we need to see more respect for and compliance with international humanitarian law, and meaningful because of the valuable proposals you made. Many of you highlighted the growing number of violations of international humanitarian law in armed conflicts. Sometimes direct attacks on civilians and medical staff. In Syria, for instance, we have witnessed hundreds of systematic airstrikes against hospitals, including barrel bomb attacks. In Yemen, the largest public hospital in Taiz city has been struck by indiscriminate shelling multiple times. And in Central African Republic, the recruitment of child soldiers, sexual and gender-based violence, as well as attacks on humanitarian personnel are an appalling reality, one that inflicts unbearable suffering on civilians and far too often obstructs the safe delivery of humanitarian assistance. So, what is the way forward now? As we have heard today, sharing knowledge and best practices can play a key role. The European Union is committed to this through its guidelines on international humanitarian law. And Germany, like others among you, issued a voluntary report on the implementation of international humanitarian law last fall. But of course, more knowledge won't stop those who deliberately target civilians or humanitarian workers. They need to be held accountable. For this to happen, we need independent and comprehensive data. In fact, sound data is the pillar for three important A's: advocacy, action, and accountability. With those in mind, France and Germany launched the Humanitarian Call for Action in 2019. Our goal remains to make the humanitarian space safer and to enable even better humanitarian assistance. 51 signatories have signed up to the call so far. So to finish, I'm really very glad that we are able to count on your support and expertise. And I would like to thank you very much for your participation and your support for our common goals. Thank you.
So thank you very much to everyone for joining us today for this very lively discussion and what we hope will turn into action moving forward and commitment as we forge ahead. Thanks to everyone who intervened and to our keynote speakers and to our hosts and co-hosts, and a good afternoon to you.